So this week we're focusing in on the ideas of Noam Chomsky. And I had you read a transcript of a speech he gave at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in 2010, which was not long after the financial crisis and bailout, so that factors in his talk a lot. The title of the talk was Human Intelligence and the Environment. I went to this piece because it is a little bit difficult to find pieces from a lot of people that are squarely focused on the environment. Chomsky, from what I could find out, had not produced a whole lot of material specifically on that topic, although he mentions it a lot, and so this speech was a good case where he did focus in on it. It's even harder to find people, especially perhaps who are good examples of political thinkers who focus on agricultural topics squarely. And so it was quite a challenge to put the syllabus together in a way that wasn't stretching. And in this case, I struggled a bit with whether to include Chomsky until I found this piece, and then I knew I could do it. It is important for people to know about Chomsky. He's probably, he is one of the foremost public intellectuals of our day. He's definitely a leftist and leans far enough to the left that in some ways he ironically does come up against and overlap to a certain extent with some current occupations of the new right, which is something that we'll touch on in this talk briefly. And that's not the first time you've encountered that. I mean, that's become kind of a theme for this part of the course, right? Because we're entering into a new era where the old left-right dichotomy may no longer apply, where new ways of thinking are emerging for better and worse. And so looking at the precursors of that is important, and Chomsky is a precursor of that phenomenon. He never did go along with the Democratic Party agenda, certainly not the Republican Party agenda, and had long been associated with a sort of anarcho-socialism. But you see here in his comments that he has been thinking about some of the problems associated with the economy, the global economy, that preoccupy certain elements also of the emerging new right. That doesn't invalidate either position. It actually points out that this may be a problem that is big enough that it needs to be tackled and is being tackled from multiple angles. So, of course, I went to his official site to try to find some good biographical information, but what I ran up against was that all the biographies that were chosen and put on that site, I assume by Chomsky, zeroed in on his linguistic theory, for which he made his name. However, that's not why we're studying him, and so it's important to note that Chomsky himself must think that that's his most important contribution, but from the outside looking in, many people know of Chomsky without even really knowing and certainly not understanding any linguistic theory, because he has become such a prominent social critic of our time. So I actually went to Wikipedia, which, after looking at a whole bunch of them, had the most information that we all would want to consider. And that's kind of a theme too, running through these various types of anarchists and thinkers that are not in the mainstream, is sometimes the best information you can get on them is pretty popular information. So anyway, I'll just read a little bit of the introduction here. Avram Noam Chomsky, born in 1928, is an American linguist, philosopher, cognitive scientist, historian, social critic, and political activist. Sometimes described as the father of modern linguistics, Chomsky is also a major figure in analytic philosophy and one of the founders of the field of cognitive science. He holds a joint appointment as Institute Professor Emeritus at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and Laureate Professor at the University of Arizona, and is the author of over 100 books on topics such as linguistics, war, politics, and mass media. Ideologically, he aligns with anarcho-syndicalism and libertarian socialism. And I think you'll see both of those coming out in this speech. Anarcho-syndicalism focuses in on the working class and the labor movement, and sees the labor movement and unionization as a ready avenue for social change, being that the workers cooperate with each other to basically, if necessary, take over their industries, or at least to control them much more in their interest and the interests of society, according to the ideology. So we will see Chomsky's preference for the working class and his concern that industries have moved out of the United States and have left many of these people without steady jobs. In the first slide, you saw a picture from his official website. There he is. He's, well, I don't know when that was taken, but he's now around 90 years old, right? And so the picture was taken fairly recently, and he has a kind of curmudgeonly appearance, and pretty much he is who he is. He starts out his talk with a little bit of irony, saying that intelligence is a kind of lethal mutation, quoting a biologist by the name of Ernst Mayr. Mayr observes that the most successful creatures on the planet tend to be relatively brainless, like insects, whereas the more intelligent they become, the fewer of them there are. I think this is just a rhetorical ploy in a way, because it isn't developed very much, but it kind of gets your attention. He then goes on to deeply criticize the Copenhagen Climate Summit of 2009, and he's particularly critical of the United States, and even more particularly critical of Barack Obama, because he doesn't think that Obama did enough to really seriously negotiate in this climate summit. The summit resulted in a non-binding aspiration to keep temperature increases around the globe below 2 degrees Celsius. And there was a lot of disagreement about how to get there, and that meant that there never was any sort of agreement to actually make it stick. In his view, the United States wasn't really behind it, wouldn't back it, and wasn't willing to follow through and make a commitment. And in that way, it basically killed the agreement. That might be putting a little bit too much blame on one country, but I think his reasoning is that the United States was and is this very big, powerful country that has the ability to set the tone, and if it doesn't go along with it or doesn't do enough, then other countries that are not as developed, for instance, have even less interest in carrying up their end of the deal. So there are several themes in this talk that are pretty characteristic of Chomsky, and are themes that are worth just highlighting, some of which we've visited before, but he deals with them somewhat differently. The first theme is monolithic politics. He points out, like I think probably the most readily retrievable thinker that we've studied that also held this opinion was Chris Hedges. The American left and right, according to Chomsky, hold pretty much identical views on economics with just differences around the edges. They agree on anti-protectionism, or, in other words, the ideal of the global free market, and therefore they agree on the basic goodness of economic globalization. In other words, neither Democrats nor Republicans are giving a lot of speeches and trying to legislate in order to foster and protect American industries against global corporate spread. So when it comes to economics, in other words, Clinton, Obama, and Clinton are not terribly different from Reagan, Bush, or Bush. And actually, that sentence may give us further heartburn, right? Because I do remember in the latest election people being quite upset that they were having to choose between the Republican candidate and another Clinton. And this previous election had people opining about selecting another Bush. And that's another problem, perhaps, in American politics, is the dynastic impulse. But just as a very important aside, though, we have to say that with the election of Donald Trump, as we're becoming more and more aware, we have something very different, at least potentially, on this score. I say potentially because we don't know exactly yet. Trump's been in office for about a year. Sometimes his rhetoric and his actions seem to be pro-free market, and sometimes they seem to be very protectionist. And it's a little early to tell which way the administration will really lean. But I think it's safe to say that Trump campaigned on an idea that wasn't popular with either of the mainstream parties. That is, pro-working class, returning jobs to Americans, returning industry to the United States, making sure that other countries don't unfairly compete against U.S. economic interests, and so on. That's a different agenda that is coming up and is being supported by, apparently, quite a few voters. Now, Chomsky gave this speech long before there was even a hint of a Donald Trump presidency, although he may have put his hat in the ring. I'm not sure. I can't remember exactly when the first time he did that was. But nobody would have taken that seriously back then. So it's just kind of ironic to note that at this point in time, the basic impulse to sort of push back against globalization is coming into expression through the new American right, and not only the new American right, but the new right in Europe as well, which is also very strongly anti-immigrant, and in some cases strongly for ethnic exclusion. I'm sure Chomsky detests Trump and probably Trump supporters, although I suspect that he might be able to see how some of the support for Trump and the Trumpist agenda comes from the underlying problems that he's examining here that have been left unaddressed. That is, namely, the problems of the working class. So that's one theme to note. Another theme is this idea of ignored externalities. It's important to just note that word, externalities. It's the idea that there are costs involved in doing business, agricultural or otherwise, that are not accounted for by either the people producing, selling, or consuming, at least not directly. So producers do what it takes to obtain a short-term profit, for instance. Using instrumental rationality, they figure out the best way to obtain that profit, maybe in corporate case for their shareholders, and this is their imperative. In the case of farming, that would mean, trying to obtain the biggest crop one can, producing the crop that obtains the most amount of profit in a global economy, and also provides people, the consumers, with relatively cheap food, all of which are kind of limited goods. But then the externalities, the external costs, he argues, are borne by everybody, and by some people unequally. So we have the workers who've lost their jobs due to them being, taken overseas. We have the cost of the polluted bayous in Louisiana and elsewhere. The pollution causes people to either have to move or at least have to adapt to an unhealthy environment. There may be cleanup costs, health costs, and of course the biggest cost, according to Chomsky in this piece, is climate change, which is an externality, an external cost that will be borne by everybody. And he finds this, again, highly ironic. It's in everybody's interest, and it's also an economic interest, right, to keep things functioning, right, at a level that we can continue to produce and we can continue to grow crops and feed ourselves in the long run. But in his view, short-run interests compete with long-run interests and beat them out time after time. And therefore, in the long run, we're creating a situation where the businesses will crash and the farms will fail, but we can't look out that far. And this is where another theme comes in, which I'll get to in a little bit, the need for government, according to Chomsky, to step in. Here we are. So, the third big theme is that big government can work, but it often doesn't. Okay? So, in Chomsky's view, there's no way that private industry on its own will be able to fix the environmental problems because of this emphasis on short-term interest, which is really, it's even like legally binding in the case of the corporation towards its shareholders. They need to do what they can to make a profit every year. So this means that, in effect, asking them to fix environmental problems that they've caused all by themselves is asking too much. They're not built for that. Yes, they have the technology to do it. They have the brain power to do it. They've got the organization to do it, but that's not their function. And Chomsky is arguing that's the function of government. He harks back to the government's response to the Great Depression as an example of how government can do what it takes to moderate and modify economic conditions. And he kind of takes that model and projects it onto the current situation and imagines work projects, that new types of work projects for people who are unemployed or underemployed in the current economy, to do things that will, in the long run, benefit the economy, as well as, of course, make things healthier. So, for instance, he talks about weatherizing old homes in order to make them more energy efficient, and building light rail to discourage people from using cars to get everywhere they're going to go. He compares the United States with other countries that have moved ahead in this area and finds us very lacking. And within Chomsky's thought, there's this notion that basically this can become a useful work project, just as the WPA projects of the Great Depression created the infrastructure that we still rely on today. So these types of work projects could also do the same. The old infrastructure is no longer good enough. It's worn down. It doesn't reflect the latest priorities. Where's the new infrastructure going to come from? In his view, it has to come from government intervention and planning. Thus, Chomsky shows himself to be a believer in Keynesian economics, the idea of trickle up, that if we employ people doing useful things and they spend their money, the economy is stimulated, we get more tax money, and also we get this infrastructure that is then used to also stimulate the economy. Now, another and corollary theme is that government has always been involved in the economy. We've touched on this a few times in this class already, that if we really look at, for instance, as we have been, the case of American agriculture, there has been very little free market for a long, long time. In the question and answer part of the manuscript that you have, he gives a couple of examples of how huge government spending, which he constantly reminds you are your tax dollars at work, were used for very specific amendments to the U.S. economy. For instance, the creation of the highway system and the emphasis on that, as opposed to creating an efficient railway system, which then made it pretty necessary for people to own cars if they wanted to get around, which then contributed to a great deal of pollution. And I might also mention, as a car owner, a great deal of spending, not only on the darn things themselves, but on keeping them fixed up all the time. Believe me, I would rather not do it. Same thing with the development of computers and the internet. He says that in both cases there was this long period of time when they were really relatively useless and extremely expensive and needed a lot of government support, and at least in the case of the internet, would probably not have been developed without that support. Well, really computers as well, although it's kind of hard to imagine that they wouldn't have eventually been developed anyway, but government gave these things a real jump start with huge infusions of money, and then later on, when they were ready, those technologies got taken up by private industry and turned into a huge and profitable business. Chomsky writes in the question and answer section, or says anyway, he says, just to indicate how surreal this is, the Obama administration essentially took over the auto industry, meaning you took it over. You paid for it, bailed it out, and basically owned the large parts of it. And they continued doing what the corporations had been doing pretty much, for example, closing down GM plants all over the place. Closing down a plant is not just putting the workers out of work, it's also destroying the community. Take a look at the so-called Rust Belt. The communities were built by labor organizing. They developed around the plants. Now they're dismantled. It has huge effects. At the same time, they're dismantling the plants, meaning you and I are dismantling the plants, because that's where the money comes from, and it's allegedly our representatives. It isn't, in fact. At the very same time, Obama was sending his transportation secretary to Spain to use federal stimulus money to get contracts for high-speed railroad construction, which we really need and the world really needs. Those plants that are being dismantled and the skilled workers in them, all that could be reconverted to producing high-speed rail right here. They have the technology, they have the knowledge, they have the skills, but it's not good for the bottom line for banks, so we'll buy it from Spain. Just like green technology, it will be done in China. So you can see clearly his pro-labor position there that ties back into his notion that we ought to have more infrastructure development and put people back to work, and also the sort of political position that the left and the right in America are not that far apart. Just one more note before I go on agriculture. Chomsky disagrees with the people that we previously studied just last week, the primitivists, like Zerzan. He doesn't think agriculture per se is the problem, it's the way that we're doing agriculture. So he says there is no particular reason to believe that agriculture is inherently destructive. We do happen to have destructive forms of agriculture, like high energy inputs, high fertilizer inputs, etc. So reading between the lines, we would have to conclude that Chomsky would support something like organic agriculture, maybe permaculture, and all of that, but he doesn't go so far as to think that agriculture itself is a problem, which puts him into the company of almost everybody except for the primitivists. The primitivists believe that even the most rudimentary agricultural techniques began the process of environmental destruction, not to mention social order that was negative, the type of social repression necessary to organize to do it. All right, well, I think that's all I needed to say about Chomsky. I have you watching a couple of his talks as well, so we can discuss all of this on the message board, and I'll see you then. Okay, bye.